Well, good evening, and welcome to another of my Across the Fence discussion videos. I'm David Vogel of davidvogel.net, and this is James Wall, a atheist philosopher and writer, and I really appreciate you joining me tonight, Jim.
Sure.
Thank you. Jim recently published an article titled "Absolute Morality from God Doesn't Exist," and I enjoyed reading it a couple weeks ago, and thought it would be a good kind of jumping off point for a discussion of morality and of kind of the implications of an atheistic or Christian worldview on one's moral system. So I invited Jim to join me for a discussion, and he graciously agreed. So our kind of basic game plan is we're going to try to do two videos. This first video tonight will focus on Jim arguing that basically the Bible, and I'll let him explain in more detail, but essentially that the Bible is a bad moral guide, that it is not a good foundation for a moral system. And then our second video, which you should find linked at the end of this one once it's recorded, our second video will focus on my argument then that atheism is not a coherent foundation for a moral system. So should be some good stuff to discuss. And again, I appreciate, Jim, you joining us. So if you want to start us off with a little further introduction of yourself, and then go ahead and begin your case.
Okay, so this is Jim Wall. Grew up in the Chicago area, been married for 27 years now, have an adult son, and I've been a atheist blogger for a number of years, something like 6 years, I believe now. I've written a couple of books on secular philosophy, have a Facebook page and YouTube channel, hoping to start making more videos. Haven't really been doing that too much, or I put something up and then I look at it again later, don't feel comfortable with it, and take it down. So I might be getting back into that. But I appreciate having this conversation. As we know, with the environment right now politically, there is so much hatred and so much unfriending going on with even relatives and good friends, and just so much animosity. So here, obviously, two people with very different views are going to have a intelligent, respectful conversation. And once again, I appreciate the opportunity, David. Hopefully, we can serve as a good role model for other discussions that are happening today.
Hopefully so. All right. So I guess your argument then, if we want to get started, is
Sure.
Related to the Bible. We had actually had a previous video that we tried to record and then had some internet difficulties, so kind of know somewhat where, we both know where we're going to be coming from a little bit here. But Jim is going to argue then, if you want to kind of start us off with your reasoning for believing that the Bible is not a good foundation for an ethical system, or that it is immoral, or however you would express it.
Sure. I don't believe the Bible, like David mentioned, is a good source. We're talking about morality. We're talking about right and wrong for individuals, for society. Obviously, something to found our laws upon. This underground ideology. The reason why I don't believe that the Bible is a good source. Also believe the same as the Quran.
Sure.
And other religious texts as well, although the Eastern religions, I think, are a little bit different. They're more philosophical, less supernaturalism. Because from my perspective, basically it's not the word of God. It is the word of men claiming to speak for God. And to believe that they were speaking for God is to believe that they somehow had more authority to do so than the other men, millions of men making the same claim throughout history. And obviously, a lot of people have claimed to speak for God during the Republican presidential primaries. Out of the 17, I think most of them claim that they prayed and God told them to run. Ironically, I think Donald Trump was one of the few people who didn't make that claim. So that, I guess that would be the first part. The second part is, based on the evidence, if it was indeed a inspired book by God, I would expect there to be much more purity as far as moral guidance. Now, obviously, you can find good moral guidance in a Bible. I think the Sermon on the Mount is the best example of that. Search for righteousness, let your deeds be a light to shine on others, be more righteous than the Pharisees. So there's definitely some good philosophy there. But unfortunately, there's also things that are very bad. And the greatest example that I come up with is regarding Moses and regarding Numbers 31, where basically he orders the slaughtering of civilians, women and children. And of course, Moses is supposed to be God's moral lawgiver, says his commandment, thou shalt not kill. But then soon after, he's killing his own people for worshiping a golden calf. And then he's killing the Midianites, including unarmed people, including children, and including women. So to me, this is not a good source of right and wrong. This is severely flawed. And then there's other stories as well.
Sure.
And obviously, the way I look at them, and the way obviously David you look at them, we have different perspectives.
Sure.
Regarding these stories, but to me, those are two basic things. It's not God; it's words of men claiming to speak for God. And when it comes to being a source of moral guidance, there's some good, but there's also some very bad, condoning slavery, condoning murder, or eternal torment and burning.
Sure.
As well. So I guess in a nutshell. That covers the points of my argument.
Excellent. No, I mean, I think that's well articulated. I mean, that's the basic case that more or less, of course, I expected. That's the pretty much the general typical argument against the morality of the Bible. And I think it's helpful the way you broke it up into two pieces. So if I could, I want to consider both, but just starting with the first piece. As far as just the words of men, speaking for God or saying that they speak for God, and I agree certainly that many people throughout history have claimed to speak for God, and I think our question, where we would disagree, is you would say none of them were telling the truth or were understanding correctly, and I would say most of them weren't telling the truth or weren't understanding correctly, which does raise the question: how would you tell? How would you, upon what grounds would I say that anybody really is speaking for God? And I think that's something that as a coherent, if you're going to make a case for Christianity that is anything more than just I just think it's true. You've got to give some reason to think that these particular people were right, that they were, in fact, speaking for God in a way that, for example, Muhammad, I would argue, was not. And in a lot of ways, this kind of gets into factual questions of history that I'm thinking probably neither of us really were anticipating focusing on this evening. If you want to get into it, we could more. But I would just say that generally speaking, my view is that if you look at, particularly at the New Testament, that there's sufficient reason to believe the accounts of Jesus' life, of his teaching, of his, particularly crucially, of his death and resurrection, that those were historical events, that therefore that would give a verification to his words, and then because he trusted and spoke of the Old Testament also as being inspired, that's in a very brief nutshell would be the reasoning for why I would then be willing to say, okay, this Bible needs to be treated more seriously because it is God's word come down to us, as opposed to just a man claiming to speak for God, and because then the authority comes from up there, as opposed to just a person's words. That would justify a different perspective. And again, certainly, I think obviously we would disagree on the historical questions in a big way. I don't know if you want to pursue that further, or if that's enough to just at least give, kind of That's my perspective on that first question.
Yeah. Well, on the history, for a long time, I really didn't know much about the historical evidence. I had seen on the teaching company, Bert Ehrman's about Jesus Christ, and that's where he brought up a lot of things I weren't aware of. As far as the history, mentioning that they were basically collecting these works and putting a name underneath them because none of them specifically said who the author was, and I think raising a lot of questions. And I know there's also mythicists out there that are claiming from the movie Zeitgeist that it was actually, some stories are referring to consolation, as far as rising and falling, and having these other more mythical type of origins, and questioning the actual historical evidence for Jesus.
Sure. Now, that is actually one thing is a common misconception as far as the documents having names attached to them is actually bizarre. If you look at the documentary evidence, those manuscripts, particularly the four Gospels, would be the allegedly historical accounts, and they were actually circulated with names attached to them. Not all of, well, it's hard to say. Not all of them have come down to us with names attached to them, but typically ancient documents like that would very often have essentially like a cover sheet, so-and-so by this person. And those that we do have, and we do have many that did have the names of apostles attached to them, the gospel according to this person's name. It's pretty, I believe, without exception, actually, that the gospel we call, say, the Gospel of John, when we find it with a name attached to it, which we do often find in those, the ancient copies that we have, it was, John's name that was there, and you don't have copies of it with, Fred's name attached. That if there is a name, it's going to be John's name. Which does give, I think, more confidence as far as the primary authorship of it.
Right. Now, John was was the later gospel.
Yes.
I believe it's Matthew is believed to be the first, from what I understand.
Yeah, Matthew or Mark.
But I also understand there's no original documents. Basically, it is copies of what is believed to be the original documents, and
Absolutely.
A selection of which ones will be included. And you mentioned, so with John, perhaps there's some that don't have a name, but you believe they can still be tied. And I'm not sure how specifically they, you could validate that certain pieces of information and incomplete works could be tied to one specifically or the other, at least with certainty.
Yeah, no, and I mean, you have to look at it like any other ancient document in the sense of, you look at the earliest existent copies. There's no ancient document that actually has the originals. When you're writing on papyrus 2,000 years ago, not so long survival unless it happens to get lucky and, be stored in a clay jar or something like that. But you do have copies as early as about 100 years after the originals were written, which is much, much earlier than, Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, Suetonius, the historian, Tacitus. Those documents that we rely on, for all of our ancient history, Josephus, those copies are hundreds of years after the originals are the first surviving copies that we have, whereas the Bible copies, just because they were so widely copied in the Mediterranean ancient world, you've got surviving copies in tremendous quantity. There's something like 10,000 just in Greek, and well over 10,000 in Latin and other languages as well. Not all of them, of course, being very early. Some of them are quite a bit later.
Sure.
But you've got surviving copies of quite an early lineage. And then you can trace out, where they were copied, and some copies went to Egypt, some copies went to the Western Church in Rome and Italy, some went to Asia Minor, and so you can see where potentially copying errors got introduced, things like that. And
right.
You've got sorry, go ahead.
And then some of the copies tell slightly different stories, as well. Because without mass communication, if you have a group of people making copies over time and originally turning stories told orally into a written copy, and then making copies. Wasn't it the ancient sea scrolls that they discovered, which were copies that told slightly different accounts?
I don't know if you're referring typically as far as the particular documents that are in the New Testament. They, as far as variants, you can say, and again, it's hard without particular examples, to really to say, okay, well, this is a variant that appears here, and let's look at the textual evidence for it, because it's a lot of just cross-referencing, and so there's this variant here that doesn't appear in all these other copies, and it's plainly, if you look at the scribal technique that was used, then probably, there's a good way to explain that this variant was caused by this kind of scribal error that's common, that sort of thing. So it's hard without that kind of particular example to cite, to really be able to speak too specifically to the accuracy of the copies. But I generally speaking, if you do get that kind of cross-referencing, you can say with a great degree of certainty what, say Matthew, what did Matthew originally say? You've got very, very good textual evidence for what the original document said. Now, what I think you were referencing was like alternative gospels, that kind of idea, like Gnostic gospels or other religious documents that didn't end up in the New Testament.
They found a Gospel of Judas.
Yeah.
I think they've found some other Gospels as well.
Yeah, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter.
Right, and then is during the time that Jesus is said to live, Bart Ehrman mentioned that the philosophers during the time, that the government officials during the time, you don't see records there. That's when ethicists start to argue, well, these stories you're seeing, which you're attributing to Jesus, well, these are actually earlier characters that had the rebirth and similar types of stories. I think I heard mentioned Apollonia had similar stories, and Horace has older stories, and so possibly what's being attributed to Jesus is actually something else entirely.
Sure. And I think, there again, there's different ones, so-called virgin birth narratives or things like that. And without, really particularly having a single example to dig into, it's hard to, you kind of got to speak in generalities. But if you do look at the particular examples that are offered, you've got everything from stories of Greek gods that supposedly impregnated women, and they're would say that's a similar kind of virgin birth narrative, that kind of thing. There's really pretty significant differences. The similarities are greatly overstated. I would argue again, and we could look at particulars. If you have particular examples to consider. But I think really the more important question to me is, you could say that we've got an account of, the fall of Rome. But you could say, well, look, there have been so many other stories of cities falling. Can't we just imagine that the fall of Rome is just, a copy of those other stories of cities falling? And you have to look then, okay, so what's our documentary and what's our historical evidence for the fall of Rome, for this particular event? And what I would argue then is, based on the quality of the historical evidence and the documentary evidence that we have from copies and as we were just talking about, that you've got a much better historical foundation for trusting the actual events of Jesus' life than some other mythological, whether there were parallels or not.
In certain cases, like the Civil War or whatever event you want to bring up where nobody's currently alive, the best source of history, they're looking for primary sources, they're looking for writings, sources of people that were actually there at the time, and obviously they're looking for other stories written by people during that time that basically complement each other.
Totally.
I remember some people arguing, well, Socrates was just completely invented.
Right.
and didn't exist, but actually it's more than Plato that wrote about Socrates. You can find another writing as well.
Right.
And plus, I don't understand why it's so hard to believe that an annoying stonecutter that was a real pain in the ass never existed. It seems
Sure.
pretty plausible.
Definitely. In fact, more plausible than God become man and lived and died. Absolutely. You'd need a stronger burden of proof
Sure.
on that one. And yeah, I think I feel like we have really only barely scratched the surface on the historical kind of question. And obviously, there's arguments that you could make and I could make and proceed on that. I don't know if you want to go further or if you want to just kind of agree to disagree on the question of historical evidence, since that wasn't really I know I didn't prepare too much specifically on that point, and you perhaps could prepare more as well. Do you want to proceed further on that, or do you want to shift to your second critique as far as morality?
We could shift to the second critique. I'm not Richard Carey or a real expert on,
Sure, yeah.
on that subject.
Yeah, and again, it's,
I just no, I've never studied it.
Yeah, sure.
Let's see, I've never studied it in great detail.
Of course, and frankly, I have not either. So we're in some sense, we're both sort of talking of, well, this is what I've heard. So if we want to shift then to your second critique as to the morality of particular events in the Bible. Let me, I guess, start by dispensing with perhaps what you expected my argument to be, which is that we should just ignore all that, in the Old Testament, that it doesn't apply today. I think that, as you said well, if you've got Moses, who we believe is a prophet of God, who we believe is, the giver of the Old Testament law, the means of God giving that Old Testament law. If he does something, you got to take it seriously. Frankly, just the same as I would argue that the moral actions of Muhammad reflect poorly on Islam. So we can't run away from just say, oh well, that's the Old Testament, so let's not talk or think about that. It is God's word, or it isn't. As a unit. So looking, you mentioned a few different moral critiques, and I'll just start with the main one that you focused on, which was the massacre of the Midianites in Numbers. And the I feel like this is one of those things where you need to sort of step back and give a bigger picture. I know we had discussed previously. You've done debates with people who believe in intelligent design, things like that. And I imagine if I just popped up and I was going to argue, and I'm like, well, no, evolution's dumb because mutations are mostly neutral or bad. I'm done. You would let me give you the fuller picture. So if I could lay out, I'll kind of go sort of broad and shallow to start with, big picture. And then if you want to follow up with, particular arguments or critiques, of that initial case. The first thing I would say is you kind of have to clarify what's going on here. And I would really lump in with the massacre of the Midianites, the various other, massacres. I mean, that it was what it was, of the Canaanite people generally, in what would become Israel. It's kind of the same thing, essentially, going on. And what that is, I think crucial context is actually, if you go back to Genesis, I don't remember the chapter and verse off the top of my head, but as God is speaking to, of course, I'll qualify for you, allegedly, speaking to Abraham, that what's recorded is he says, I'm going to send you into Egypt for 400 years. Because I'm going to bring you out and give you the promised land after 400 years. But at this time, quote, the iniquity of the Amorites, basically a representative people who lived there, is not yet complete. So the idea being there that it is a matter of judgment rather than just ethnic cleansing, which, by the way, raises its own questions as far as the idea of judgment, but clarifying what's going on here. Furthermore, as Israel then comes out of Egypt, You have God gives them instructions: don't mess with Edom, don't mess with Moab, don't mess with Ammon. There's multiple peoples that he says you're not allowed to even begin to have any sort of aggression against them, because I have a particular judicial role that I want you, Israel, to play, of being an instrument to punish these particular people, along the same lines. If you're familiar with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, of just people that is particularly wicked. And if you look historically, we do have outside the Bible even accounts of infant sacrifice, all kinds of these were very wicked peoples, just generally speaking. So these people then are the object, God says, of my judgment. And then when you come into the land, you do have the massacre initially of the Midianites. They then pass from there to Jericho. And what's striking there at Jericho is you have really emphasized quite a lot that the woman of Jericho, Rahab, who's brought out of Jericho and not punished because she basically allies herself with God. She becomes one of God's people. And then the very next chapter, Joshua 7, you have an Israelite, Achan, who sins against God's command. And he is then treated like the Canaanites were to be treated. He is killed. And going forward, you see again, there's commands in Leviticus, treat the stranger who's living among you as yourself. In fact, that's the first articulation of the same golden rule that we get from Jesus in the New Testament. You have in 2 Samuel, God punishes Israel for massacring the Gibeonite people under King Saul. They massacred them, and Israel is punished for that because you are not either in the New Testament or in the Old Testament to go out and say, well, I'm just going to kill these people because I want their stuff, because they're a different people, because they are they look funny, whatever. It's a question of are you against God, or are you submitted to him? Are you one of his people? Is the important qualification, rather than it being a racial or ethnic kind of thing, which of course raises its own questions. But I've kind of gone on for a while, so I didn't know if you have anything you want to. I'll give you a moment before I elaborate if you want to comment on anything.
Well, specifically when we're talking about the Midianites, chapter 31, the background is in chapter 25, where Midianite women are accused of seducing Israeli men on Mount Peor.
Right.
And so this is why God orders Moses to go to war.
Correct.
Just to make sure we're on the same page. I'm not taking anything out of context or anything that I'm missing as far as the interpretation. But
if I could just add really quickly that just another element is not just that, but also hiring Balaam, who was a pagan prophet, basically, sort of along with Midian and Moab, hire Balaam to curse the people of Israel. So basically, whether with the seduction of Numbers 25 or that, again, they're setting themselves as enemies of God's people, would be the significance of that. So just wanted to add that bit about Balaam, but carry on.
And then as the story goes, Moses brings his soldiers together. They go to war, they slaughter all the Midianite soldiers, and the Israeli soldiers bring all the people to Moses. Obviously, the people who weren't soldiers, the boys, the men too old to fight, and all the women. And Moses orders the killing of the boys, killing of all the women that had been with a man. So you're talking about women who were pregnant, mothers, grandmothers, except for the virgins. Those are, he says, the soldiers keep them for themselves. And I believe the number of virgins is said to be 30,000. So this is obviously a large amount of people that we're talking about here. And so the slaughtering, we're talking about the slaughtering babies, children, pregnant women, mothers, and grandmothers. And I just don't see how that could ever be justified, the intentional targeting and butchering of people, even if you say, well, that they tried to do these things against Jehovah, even then, this is a story that just very really disturbs me, and in my mind, it's just something that can't be justified if you are going to look at the Bible as a inspired book of moral guidance. This provides the flaw in my mind that makes everything unravel. And there's other stories as well, but this one particular is important to me because it's not just any part of the Bible or anybody doing this, but it's specifically Moses, who's specifically the moral lawgiver in his society.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with you on its significance, absolutely. And I think I guess a couple of points on this. First, it should disgust us. It should sadden us. It is not what should be that this sort of thing would happen. I think similar to in the New Testament, we're told that Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus, and he knew he was going to raise him again. But the reality of death in the world is something that we should find repulsive and saddening. And in fact, I would actually suggest that that's significant to our understanding of religious questions. That we do find it so bizarre and repugnant, just that we feel almost that death generally is an unnatural thing. I think I would argue that it is. That it is a punishment, a consequence of sin, as we're told, in the Garden of Eden, that sin brought death itself into the world. So it shouldn't be, and particularly the sort of horrible, violent death that is envisioned or recorded here in Numbers. So, on the particulars, though, of that punishment, I guess I would say that this is one of those places where the Christian. Well, let me actually back up and say that looking at this, no Christian can take it as a model for behavior. Well, I'm going to go kill all the Russians because maybe they're not Christians. Whatever. That again, as I said earlier, that it was a very specific thing of this particular people. There should be a punishment of. So as any sort of broader principle, we're precluded from that.
Can it be if there's Christians that want to do harm? Is this something they can look at to provide some type of wealth that was okay for Moses and he was doing it based on God's word? Then we're going to go ahead and move forward with what we're going to do against these people and doing the same thing for God and cleansing these people that are of a different religion.
Absolutely, and I want to say that I'm not moving past that question of the particular morality of that action. But yeah, going to that objection, I think that's an excellent point, and I would say yes, it could be used in that way, but it would be used, if so, against what the Bible itself says. And again, I would specifically point you to the Gibeonites, 2 Samuel 21, I believe, where Israel is explicitly judged and punished for massacring the Gibeonites, and that's just one example. But if you read the Bible, what it plainly actually says is you may not go and do this sort of thing without a specific. The only instance of the Bible of this sort of thing happening is as Israel moves into the Promised Land. And really, in a lot of ways, it should be grouped, by us mentally with, again, the punishment of Sodom and Gomorrah, Noah's flood, whatever the mechanism. The idea is a particular, singular, targeted punishment of a particular wicked people, which has no broader application to, now let me go and do the same thing. I'm not going to create a giant flood to destroy the earth. just because it happened, one time. And there's no, again, more importantly, there's no biblical justification for doing so. Quite the opposite. But yes, I would say, people can use anything to justify bad behavior. So there may be, but again, it's against the Bible and not with it. I can go back then to the Midianites, unless you have.
Sure.
Okay. So I think, again, it's helpful to me to group this massacre of the Midianites with Sodom and Gomorrah, with Noah's flood, etc., because I think that's its proper category. It looks to us like, again, an ethnic thing, a racial thing, but because, again, of the while it was a punishment of the Midianite people, the reason for it was again that of sin. And that's where you and I are just going to have really fundamentally different, totally presuppositions on this question. From an atheistic perspective, this is murder, this is massacre, this is genocide. In the sense of, yes, it is the wiping out of a people is the goal, and the difference of perspective is one that says ultimately what sin is the consequence of sin is genocide on the human race. That every one of us is dying as a consequence of sin. That you're going to die as a consequence of sin, I'm going to die as a consequence of sin. That the implication of mankind's rebellion against God, collectively as a race, and individually as, when you and I do wicked things, the consequence of that is death. And so death itself is a judicial thing. And therefore, that's that's the problem. That's the problem of the Bible. You start off, if you think of it as a story, you start off with the tension, the conflict, the disaster in the very first chapters. You have humans sinning and rebelling against God, and then the narrative of the Bible is basically God, because he is not only just but also loving, working out a way to basically bring back and restore what was lost. What the human race did to itself is then set right in Christ to restore that relationship that's lost. So if you understand it in that sense that that sin brings death by separation from God, and then every death ultimately, whether it be a death of cancer, a death of plague, a death of starvation, a death of any sort of warfare, is equally awful and horrible. It is a consequence of that human rebellion against God. And therefore, what is important for the human being is to, think of it like this. One of the horrible things about leprosy is that it is a disease where you have things that are bad for you, but you can't feel them. That is because you lose the ability to feel pain in leprosy. When you injure yourself, when there's a problem, you don't realize it. And the problem then is that you've got a real problem, but you can't tell. And so what God does with stories, with pictures, like Noah's flood, like Sodom and Gomorrah, like the killing of tribes in the Promised Land, is to paint a picture and say, this is what you and I are too. This is every one of us is a sinner who is going to die as a consequence of sin. And with that awareness of the problem, with that awareness of the disease, so to speak, you're then driven to look for a solution for it, which, for example, Rahab found by joining under God's people, which is extended to all in the New Testament through Christ. So the particular, go back to the Midianites. Yes, I honestly, it does just make me ill to think of killing as you said, children, pregnant women, that sort of thing. But I think the problem for us really is not that makes us ill. I think it should make us ill. But really the problem is that the story of the kid who dies of cancer, the story of the pregnant woman who's hit by a car, should also make us equally ill. And I think, it does.
Right. But with Moses, it's per God's command, although God never specifically commanded to kill the civilians. So when God speaks to Moses, so he makes no mention of it. He talks about the wealth is supposed to go 1/3 to the priests, 1/3 to the soldiers, 1/3 to the tabernacle, and I'm not sure, because I believe it was 1/3 of the virgins as well, and I'm not sure what that means. But so he doesn't. God just says go to war. Doesn't say.
Yeah, is
that just Moses or?
Yes, no, good question. So the understanding of that particular, it was considered holy war, is what it's usually called today in English, translating and speaking of it. The idea was that you would go in and you would kill all the people, and it is that because of the same message of Noah's flood, of Sodom and Gomorrah, etc., is that sin does destroy everybody, everything. And so, as a warning, and it's, frankly, as I think of, a person who is killed in that, Midianite massacre, I do actually take some comfort in the idea that just like I read on the news and somebody dies of cancer today, they come into the presence of a God who is just, who is merciful, who is loving. So also did those Midianites. And in fact, perhaps even the very act of seeing the power of God and defeating them was enough to make them say, okay, to have a Rahab moment, some of them, and say, this God, have mercy on me, which, you see in the New Testament, the thief on the cross. That is, God accepts even that sort of a very embryonic kind of faith. So perhaps even the act of this horrible defeat and massacre perhaps became a thing of mercy to some of the Midianites.
So it's possible, and this is before Jesus, so it's possible that the Midianites would be in heaven, or, is it possible that does simply death exist, or it has to be either hell or heaven, one or the other?
The Bible would say that there is heaven and hell. That those are basically your two. Those are the two exit ramps. And so yes, obviously this is before Jesus. I will tell you, I expect to find some of those Midianites in glory. That is speculation. Certainly, there's nothing that would say that they couldn't be on account of the Old Testament. What multiple points of the New Testament say is that so in the Old Testament you have the sacrificial system is the way of atoning for sins, and so the sacrifice of animals in the temple and tabernacle and so on is the way of sin being atoned for, drawing near to God, etc. And so what the New Testament says is it's amusing how dismissive it is. I believe this is Hebrews 7 says this, look, the blood of bulls and goats is not going to forgive your sins. And it's a sign and a symbol of faith in God, which then ultimately that faith, it seems sort of mechanistic to say retroactively, but that Christ's sacrifice then becomes the means by which I am saved today by that, but also, Abraham, before Christ, by his faith, though he didn't realize it, he didn't have an understanding that this was happening. His faith then was the means also by which, through Christ's sacrifice, he was saved. So could the Canaanite, could the Midianite, could Rahab be saved by faith in that way as well? The Bible would say yes.
Okay. And you mentioned, the flood a couple times as a similar story. Now, there's Christians who believe that the flood literally happened, and it was a global flood. And then other, Christians who believe that it was a metaphor or possibly a local flood. What's your take on it?
I would say that just reading that the Bible seems to pretty clearly present it as a historical event that was worldwide, not just in the particular narrative, but then in how it's referenced in other parts of the Bible. And therefore, that would be my belief as well, yeah.
Okay. And then are you the young Earth believer then as well?
That is, I would say, generally yes. I think there's defensible other ways of reading Genesis, but I would read it to say, yeah, young Earth generally, which I can feel you desperately wanting to embark on a new debate.
Well, that's a discussion. But I mean, obviously there's a whole lot of areas we can go, but this was to focus on, is the Bible, can be trusted for being a book of moral guidance, and obviously we have some pretty big disagreements there.
Sure. Well, thank you. I think it's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Sure.
I think I've said all that, I've given my closing statement. I don't know if you have anything that you want to finish up with, or if you're content as well with kind of what you've said so far.
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as my argument of, yes, there's some things in the Bible that are very good, but some things that aren't good, and the fact that, people that want to do harm can find reasoning, and people who want to do good can't find reasoning, to me shows that it's not an absolute source, because to me, if it was an absolute source, then everybody should be able to get the same interpretation of what it means.
Sure, certainly. Yes, and I guess just maybe a very quick summary as well, as I should offer as far as to wrap up my what I've been arguing is really that we have to understand stories like Noah's flood, stories like Sodom and Gomorrah, stories like cleansing of the Promised Land, etc. Again, that an understanding of the significance of sin and the seriousness of sin and the consequences of sin, not just on Midian, but for everyone, is essential. Which obviously, of course, raises a whole host of other questions for both of us as to, whether that understanding of sin and of the consequences of sin, etc. That's a factual question also, which could be discussed perhaps in a later day. But for the moment, I do look forward to. We'll have to schedule in the upcoming week or two, perhaps, an opportunity to talk then about the moral implications of atheism. So I'm looking forward to that discussion. But for now, again, thank you very much for your time. And I'll go ahead.